Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And lately, I've been reading Emily Wilson's translation of Homer's Iliad.
And I've been reading Umberto Eco's novel, The Name of the Rose.
And so we're going to talk about those books. But first, Happy New Year!
Happy New Year! And happy birthday, Spouter-Inn.
Ho-ri-o-ho, 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 ho. Oh my word, yes, we've been doing this this is our 6th birthday, is that right?
It is, isn't that amazing?
I can't think of time anymore. I simply can't. But it's also exciting because we're trying out a whole new format for the new year. And, we'll see how this goes. Listeners, bear with us as we figure out what this new format feels like.
Yeah, and I'm excited about it because we've been sort of playing responsively or sort of speculatively about what might we do a little bit different over the last, year and a half. And it's been fine, but it was never quite comfortable. It was like trying on clothes that don't quite fit and like maybe not. But now I think we've got something that's going to be, I'm very excited about at least. So I think it'll be fun.
I'm also excited about it. Before we get to that, though, I just wanted to ask, we just had the holiday season. Did you get any books for the holidays? Did you give any books for the holidays?
Yeah, both of these. Actually, I was laughing at myself when I was wrapping because books are the main thing I ended up buying for people, which is not completely unusual for me. But this year, I think it's even more than in the past. I gave one on mosque architecture to my son. I gave one on Iranian history to his father. I gave one on Dorothy Day to my mother's husband, who's really interested in.
Who's Dorothy Day?
Oh, she was someone associated with the Catholic worker movement, so very much involved in social justice and in really looking after and caring for people, especially in the Lower East Side. And so a really interesting figure in terms of like urban history, in terms of history of Catholicism, and just, a sort of biography. So that was kind of cool. And I also gave a copy to a very dear person of Marian Engel's Bear, which is a book we talked about together.
We sure did. Were they ready for it? Did they know what they were getting into?
I haven't heard any responses yet, so I will report.
Wonderful. I only gave one book out this year, which was just a little sort of stocking stuffer I got from my husband. It's a little book called Thrust, A Spasmodic Pictorial History of the Codpiece in Art.
Ooh.
Yeah, a little tiny book with a bunch of pictures in it and, some academic dithering about the history of the codpiece, which I haven't had a chance to read, but it looks, silly and delightful and informed, but not taking itself seriously.
Well, it's neat to think about that. Like, what are we doing when we give people books as gifts? Like, either individually, in a one-off kind of way, or at holiday times. And that's been in my mind because I was just looking back and pulling out the books that people gave me at the holidays and noticing what they have in common. Because when people give you books, it kind of might give you a sense of what they're interested in. But a lot of times it's telling you what they think you're interested in, like reflecting you back to yourself.
Yeah.
Which is a rare opportunity to kind of, get a glimpse of that. And so the gifts I got that were books, I got a copy of Amanda Peters' novel, The Berry Pickers, from my daughter. She's a Mi'kmaq writer, and it looks like a really good book. I read a lot more nonfiction than fiction, but still that one looks really good. And then somebody else gave me Aaron Robertson's The Black Utopians, Searching for Paradise and the Promised Land in America. And that also looks absolutely fascinating. And a book by Rebecca Nagel, By the Fire We Carry, The Generations-Long Fight for Justice on Native Land. And so 2 out of these 3 have something in common, that they're by Indigenous writers, but all of them have something in common around communities that form especially around land and around sort of protecting their communities and looking after them. And so I thought that was really interesting that when people reflect you back to yourself through the books they buy for you, like, I don't know, digging into that a little bit more deeply and figuring out what's motivating that in ways you don't even see yourself.
If that's the case, then what does it mean this year when I wasn't given any books?
Well, maybe it's an off year. Maybe next year there'll be books.
Maybe. I take that back. I actually did get one book, but it was just a silly book of pictures of cats, but technically a book.
That is a book.
And, not an inappropriate book to get me, I suppose. But I don't know what that says about me.
Yeah, I've noticed actually a number of people, like friends on social media and stuff like that, reporting on the books they've read this year. And not in a, either self-flagellating or flagellating other people, you should read more, but just sharing what they've been looking at. And people seem really happy about it. Like there seems to be a very good vibe in sharing this, feeling comfortable in reading spaces. And I wonder if it's people are putting a little bit less pressure on themselves in ways we've talked about together before. That is, you don't need to read the whole book. You can read part of the book. If you're not making forward progress through the book, you can start at the end of the book and read the last couple chapters and work your way back as long as you're enjoying it. Like I think that way of reading is percolating through the culture a little bit more.
I also just like seeing what people are reading. I don't know, especially people who I don't get to see, and I don't get to sort of, look at the back of their book while we're on the subway together or whatever, which is always such a fun thing when I grew up in New York City, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But now I just get to see people who post it on social media. Not as fun, but still better than nothing.
And I know when people read on their devices, you can't see what they're reading so conveniently without being really rude, right?
Yeah, it's no fun. A young man, killed in battle by sharp bronze, looks glorious in every way. His body is fine and handsome, even in his death. But when the dogs despoil a grey old head and grey old beard, and shame his private parts, this is the most heartrending sight of all for poor, unhappy mortals. So I've been reading Emily Wilson's translation of Homer's Iliad, which I assume most of our listeners are probably familiar with. The Iliad is, of course, an ancient Greek poem that was originally composed and performed orally, but then written down about 2,800 years ago, give or take. And it tells the story not of the entire Trojan War, but of a few weeks towards the end of the war. And in particular, it's the story of a time when the warrior Achilles was disrespected by his allies and stuff happened. The epic poem tells of the events that fell out from Achilles' feelings of disrespect. It's been translated many times into English. Emily Wilson's translation came out in 2023. That was after we did our episode on Homer's Odyssey, where we read her translation of that epic poem. And she was kind enough to join us for a bonus episode. And I thought, I'll use this first episode in our new format to give myself an excuse to go back to this text and to reread it with fresh words.
It's awesome to be coming back to it now, again, where it's 6 years since we started, because the Iliad was, of course, the very first book we did together, right? So it's neat to come around to it again through a different translation with fresh eyes at another time.
Exactly. And it was also interesting because, when I think this was on the podcast, but when we spoke with Emily Wilson, she mentioned that she loves the Iliad more than the Odyssey, which is not the common opinion these days, I think. But she reiterates this in the introduction to her book, that she absolutely loves this piece and finds it to be so incredible and so rich.
Yeah, it is gorgeous.
Well, it is, at least in times, there are definitely moments of it that are fascinating and beautiful and striking and riveting. But it does have, I'm finding as I'm going through this book, quite a lot of, and then this Greek fought this Greek, who, by the way, had a family back home. And then they killed this Greek, who also had a family back home. And let me tell you about this person you'll never hear from again. And there's a lovely memorializing feeling to this. And it is kind of remarkable how wide the world that this poem paints is, even though it is just describing people getting stabbed by spears and dying for a lot of it. It still nevertheless opens up in all these remarkable ways. But I admit I do find a lot of those passages really, really kind of a slog. I don't know.
How do you feel about the catalog of ships? Because people are kind of two minds about it. Sometimes people describe it as one of the greatest poetic achievements of the whole Iliad. And I have to confess, even though I really enjoy lists, my eyes glazed over, before too long. So does that strike? How did that feel for you? Was that something that was more beautiful or more, eye glazing?
It's soporific in a very specific way, I suppose. I know what it is, and I know how long it lasts. I have a real sense of that half of book 2, where they just list the ships and all the people from it. So I can get into a rhythm for it, and especially when it's in verse, right? This is a translation into free iambic pentameter. It doesn't rhyme. So everything has to fit into the lovely rhythm of iambic pentameter, just like it had to fit into the dactylic hexameter, the basic rhythm of ancient Greek poetry in the original. And I don't know, there can be something nice about that. I can put up with it for the couple hundred lines that it takes in book 2. But then you get several books that mostly are people dying, and it feels like a longer version of the ship list. It's just the casualty list.
Yeah. Yeah.
That said, lots of great moments in this book. And in the translator's note, she really lays out her goals very clearly, where she's talking about how, she loves this. She's been reading this since she was young in the original Greek. And she finds it a very clear and easy to read poem in the Greek. Once you've learned Greek, apparently. My Greek is, I took a semester or two, but that's about it. It's very limpid. It's very flowing. It's very parsable, right? By which I mean, it was an oral poem. People were sitting there listening to it. It wasn't twisting its language up, putting the words in, so to speak, the wrong order, like some highfalutin English poetry translations of the Iliad might have tried to do. It's very clear. And that was the thing that she was going for, perhaps more than anything else, was to represent the clear, swift briskness of this poem. And I think she achieved that. Like, it's a very readable poem without just becoming prose.
And what's really ironic and bizarre, I don't know how much you followed this, the public responses to the translation. There's formal responses in the form of reviews and things like this, and more learned conversations, but there's also the social media space. And some of that has been really weird, very gendered, right? In terms of who's the right person to do this kind of translation. And some of the commentary in that social media space has kind of tried to make a fault out of the virtue you were just describing, that simple language. Some of them even represented as a kind of oversimplification or an overly colloquial way of rendering what should, in the minds of these critics, right, be highfalutin, right? Should be that kind of, they're expecting a kind of grand style that comes from those translations of earlier generations that you're describing. So it's weird how that social space kind of filters response through all kinds of contemporary lenses.
Yeah, I saw a review that did that. It was kind of, it was generally positive, but it did make a few of those kinds of claims, including a claim that unrhymed iambic pentameter is just kind of the easy default mode. It's not a very engaging meter, but so was the dactylic hexameter, right? Any poet worth their salt back in the day would have known how to write in that. It's not the most sophisticated or tricksy mode of writing poetry. And so to reflect it in a fairly simple, basic, almost default mode for the target language you're translating into seems to make perfect sense to me. And similarly, I saw the argument in that piece about how, this is published by Norton. It's intended for a student audience. It's intended to be, a child's first encounter with the Iliad, and then they can go up to the fancier ones. And how wonderful that Norton was able to get this incredibly easy to read version out of, the translator. And it's okay, but first off, I fully believe that Emily Wilson was honest in why she made the translation choices she did. And secondly, the original was incredibly popular and appealed to a wide variety of people. It was not locked away behind vast amounts of required knowledge and ability to understand tricky literature. It feels, I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, but I fully buy that this was a much more immediate and popular piece than it has often been translated as in English.
Well, you're putting your finger on something really important, I think. Who is literature for? Right? And this capacious sense of the text that, like you were saying with regard to the Iliad, opened itself out to a whole range of readers and listeners, importantly, right? Because it's an oral poem, right? To listeners, what happens over time is that it becomes this kind of cultural capital, and it develops these kind of defined audiences that are understood as appropriately having access to it. So there's something weird going on there with regard to canon formation and who's in and who's out, how a community is constituted through a relationship to a text, which I find super interesting and super creepy sometimes.
Yeah.
It can be very weaponized, right? Kind of.
Yeah. And you can tell when these think pieces come out that feel mostly like incoherent beef with something that they have to admit is actually pretty good. I don't know. That was the vibe I got from that review. I may not link to it in the show notes because I don't think it does anybody any good to read
No.
it. But
Well, one of the things I'm wondering, like as you're describing the experience of reading this translation, we did the Iliad together 6 years ago, but two things have changed. Like, one thing that's changed is you're reading it in a different version, Emily Wilson's version. But the other thing that's changed is, you're different. Like it's 6 years later, things are different. So does it look different to you? Is the experience of reading, are you seeing different things? Are you responding to different things? What's that like?
well, I mean, the other thing that is a bit different, but perhaps also the same, is just the world that we're living in.
Mm,
And quite a lot of the Iliad is about powerful men who have egos that are very easy to bruise.
mm-hmm,
And it's a lot of people who are spending a lot of energy maintaining those egos and dealing with the aftermath of insults. It all begins with a special prize, specifically a woman, being taken away from Achilles by Agamemnon, and how Achilles gets really upset about this loss of perceived honor that comes from that act, and then dealing with the aftermath of that. That's the instigating act for the entire poem.
mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh man, just the amount of bruisable egos that we seem to be dealing with
Yes,
in the
some things
political
never
sphere
change,
these
right?
days. It just feels more so now. I mean, you're right. Yeah, things never change, but it does feel like 2025 is a little sharper than even 6 years ago was. So I don't know. That is feeling very fresh on this read.
Yeah. No, the world is different. Do you feel like you're different too? Like, do you feel there are things that strike you differently because you're in a different place? Or do you feel like that's pretty much, there's not a big difference over those 6 years?
I don't know that I feel that I'm different reading it necessarily, but I will say I had to do some other reading and watching for my other podcast. We're doing a Godzilla movie, so naturally I had to look at some ancient Greek texts.
Of course.
Of course. And so one of the things that I did was I rewatched the 1969 film by Pier Paolo Pasolini, Medea, starring Maria Callas as Medea.
I've never seen that. It sounds great.
Well, I really like it, but it is very much a challenging art house picture that a lot of people don't like, and I totally understand. It more or less follows the plot of the Euripides play, but the movie does not want to explain to you at all what's going on. Like, it is not giving you clues. It goes into flashbacks and dream sequences without indicating that. It doesn't tell you, 10 years have passed, Medea. Medea is a woman who Jason of the Argonauts meets while going to get the Golden Fleece, and they marry, and then 10 years later he is bored of her and marries somebody else, and in revenge she kills her 2 children to make him sad. That's the basic plot. Fun times.
Actions have consequences, Chris. I'm sorry.
Exactly. The movie is slow-paced and gorgeous and does not have a lot of dialogue, and is really interested in ritual, in trying to understand what the ritual of this kind of prehistoric, certainly too far back for us to really access easily, world is like. And as I'm reading the Iliad while watching this movie, I'm feeling like that's also going on in Homer. There's a lot of loving, detailed description of rituals, of slaughter of animals and so forth.
Yes.
And it goes over it step by step very carefully, as if in a way that, again, I'm not an expert on this, so I don't know sort of what we know and what we don't know about this, but it feels like it's all talking about stuff that is well in the past, that these are the rituals that used to be done, and not necessarily how we do them now. But I'm gonna hold on to this memory that we have of them and lovingly recreate it. I don't remember ever encountering as we would do, like we're not slaughtering the ox as we would slaughter the ox.
Mm-hmm.
It always feels like it's something that these heroes of the past are doing, if you see what I mean. And that was a texture I didn't remember from the previous time I read it.
Yeah, that's really perceptive and really interesting. I think you're absolutely right. There's this loving, detailed description of sacrifice and of ritual, right? But there's nothing that connects it to the present day world, like that the reader is inhabiting. It's always detached or at arm's length or something like that. That's very cool to think about.
Yeah. Also, for that podcast, I read a Sophocles play that I had never read before. Have you read the Philoctetes?
No, I haven't. What's it like?
So it's also related to the Trojan War story, like in the Iliad. It is about a guy, Philoctetes, who was supposed to go over with everybody on the way to Troy for the war, but whoops, he went into a temple he wasn't supposed to go into, got bit by a snake, and now he's unable to walk easily, and boy, does his leg smell. like
Oh.
real bad. Like it's
Oh.
messing with the sacrifices to the gods. They are not going to be happy is the excuse that they give, because the solution to this is Odysseus leaves him behind on an island alone.
Ah.
10 years later, there's a prophecy that the Greeks are going to need this guy to finally beat Troy. So Odysseus has to go back and rescue him. And it's one of those Greek plays where somebody has had a very bad day, or in this case, a very bad 10 years, and they get to complain about it. And I loved it. That is my favorite kind of Greek play. And it was so good. I'm so happy I got to read this.
Oh,
I mean, there's a bit
wow.
more going on in it, but that was my favorite part of it. It's just delightful.
I'm really intrigued now. I'm going to definitely look for it.
So, and of course, it's got some of the same, characters. It feels like, to my mind, again, I don't fully know what's floating about. I'm not an expert, but it feels like Sophocles has been reading the Iliad or has been thinking about the Iliad, that the stories of the Trojan War as they appear in Philoctetes reflect how they're represented in the Iliad a few centuries before,
Like, not like fan fiction exactly, but like it's another story in the same universe, kind of.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
That's very cool.
So in that sense, that in the past 6 years, I've read a few things, and quite recently, I am looking at a few other things that happen to be related to varying degrees to this piece, have been influencing how I'm reading it this time, and that's been really interesting.
Yeah.
I don't think that the Godzilla movie had a lot of impact on my reading of the Iliad, but I wish it had.
I have to ask, how exactly did you get from preparing for a Godzilla movie episode to Sophocles and the Medea movie?
So at the end of the movie, which is Godzilla versus the Sea Monster, aka Abira Horror of the Deep, has Godzilla alone on an island, which is about to explode. He'll be fine. He jumps off into the sea. It'll be okay. But he's very isolated and very alone, and everybody's leaving him there. And, we're watching this movie in the context of a Mystery Science Theater 3000 episode where they are making fun of the movie, and the little silhouettes on the bottom of the screen are making jokes about it. And one of them says, "What is this, a Greek tragedy? Is this Medea?" And it's like, let me think about that. That's a fun thing to think about for a second. So we talk about that in the episode.
That's excellent.
Another thing that I was thinking about, okay, we've got a new translation of the Iliad, and it's very readable and very delightful. And it made me think of one of my other favorite translations of the Iliad, or at least the first 3 books of the Iliad, which are by a poet named David Melnick. I think I may have mentioned this to you before.
The name sounds familiar, but I can't place it.
He was a Bay Area poet in the mid-20th century, later, sort of 60s, 70s into the 80s. He translated the first 3 books over a few years in a work that was called Men in Aida. And it is a translation that doesn't so much try to translate what the words mean as it does try to translate what the words sound like. Yes.
Yeah, I remember this now. You telling me about this. Yeah. Oh, that's so cool.
So it's absolutely, well, I don't want to overstate it, but it is basically incomprehensible, especially if you try to read it aloud. But if you look at it at the page, it makes little sentences out of the sound of the Greek words.
That's very cool.
And the author, who is a gay man, attempted to infuse as much gay erotic subtext into every line as he could. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but it really amps up the sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, gay sex stuff is going on here.
Well, it is a useful corrective to the Troy movie. Right?
Exactly.
Which shamefully totally got rid of Patroclus or made him into like some cousin played by Orlando Bloom. I don't know what was going on there, right? So it's a useful corrective, I think, to be reminding us of what's really going on there.
The first 2 lines go, and again, this won't make any sense, but bear with. Men in Aida, they appeal, eh? A day, O Achilles. Allow men in, Emery Achaeans. All gay ethic, eh? Like, again, kind of hard to parse when you're just hearing it read aloud, but all gay ethic, eh? I mean, so Men in Aida has been available through an open access edition that was put out by, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this correctly, Alcheveri, which is an imprint that is now run by friends of ours over at Punctum Books. So you can go and check that out for free. But also collected works of his entire poetry output in 1 volume. Not a massive poetry output, but still came out in 2023. And I've been, having that bright yellow color. It's called Nice, which is lovely. And having it on my bookshelf and poking into it and looking at these impenetrable words and really enjoying the disconnect from the language.
That's awesome. It's neat thinking about, we're starting out talking about translation. It's neat to think about language as both, the thing where you move from one language to another, from one verse form to another, and language is like, I don't know, the thing that transforms. And then almost the inverse here, where the language stays, at least in some kind of audible form, but meaning is all jumbled around in these creative kinds of ways. So it's really neat to think about them as like two sides of one coin or something like that.
Yeah. I also find it to be like a very good reminder of just how many different ways you can approach a text.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously there are many things that you're going to be able to get out of Emily Wilson's translation that you're not going to get out of a translation that's just trying to imitate the fundamental sound of the poem in its original language. But, there might also be things that you can get out of the pure sonic experience, an attempt to replicate that to an English audience and encourage them to keep going a little further. Like if I give you English words, maybe you'll keep playing with these soundscapes a bit longer. Maybe that'll, even if they don't really fully add up to anything coherent, maybe you'll get an ear for that. Maybe you'll get a taste for that.
Yeah, that's why I've always thought it's so wonderful. Like I'm thinking way back when to teaching some of the texts that we've talked about, how it was often wonderful to be able to share in the class, whether reading yourself or playing a recording of that text in its original language. Even if students in the class didn't have that language at all, just the sonic quality was giving you something. It was giving you some kind of knowledge of the text. You couldn't even put in words, right? But it was giving you something else, something different.
Yeah, and I don't know. I feel like it's fundamental to my sense of language and literature to occasionally hit a wall of incomprehension and think about it and sort of deal with it and potentially just enjoy the aesthetic experience of it. But to stop focusing so much all the time on semantic meaning, like the meaning as a package of information being transmitted by language, and to focus again on the language itself.
Yeah, it's like when you hit a kind of a wall at a certain point, and that in itself is pleasurable and interesting, right? That's where the limits are, right? And it's not just like a piece of literature is not just about like you said, information that's being packaged up and handed to you, and you unwrap the package and you've got this information. It's like, I know this maybe is a little trite, but it's like a dance, or it's like relationshipy. It's like there's something going on there in terms of exchange, and you do hit a limit.
Yeah.
And that's very pleasurable.
And that's why I like the list of ships. That's why that's the part of the Iliad that always sticks to my head the most, because meaning just falls apart for a while there.
It does.
Did you know that there's like a Greek city called Epi? Love it. Love it.
Along one stretch of wall I found a bookcase, still miraculously erect, having come through the fire I cannot say how. It was rotted by water and consumed by termites. In it there were still a few pages. Other remnants I found by rummaging in the ruins below. Mine was a poor harvest, but I spent a whole day reaping it. As if from those disjecta membra of the library, a message might reach me. I collected every relic I could find. So I read, or I should say maybe reread, Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. Is that a book you've ever read?
It's a book I've tried to read, and I bounced off it pretty hard.
Yeah, no, I can understand that, because there are parts of it where you're just so lost in the weeds, right? But at the same time, it's also, I think, a very neat book in certain ways. The reason I came back to it actually was completely ridiculous and serendipitous. My kids are here over the holidays, so I've been watching lots and lots and lots and lots of movies. And so one of the movies we watched was Name of the Rose. I watched it with my daughter Camilla. And that made me think, I haven't read that book for years. Like I had read it ages and ages ago when I was like still in my teens, like not long after the English translation came out. And then I'd read it maybe once or twice after that, but it'd been decades. And it was really neat to come back to it, and really neat to have the freedom, which I wouldn't have had earlier in life, to skip through and skip around the book and read it in this kind of grazing kind of way. So that was really neat.
Interesting. Yes.
Should I describe the book a little bit? I have no sense of how popular, like we were talking about the Iliad earlier, and there we don't really need to summarize the plot, partly because we've done that book together before in the podcast, and partly because it's like, very
It's the
canonical.
Iliad. It's pretty famous. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty famous. Whereas The Name of the Rose, I think a lot of people maybe have heard of it. I don't know how widespread knowledge of the plot is anymore.
I mean, it's got something to do with monks in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, tell me what you remember, and then I will elaborate, or I'll embroider around the edges of that.
All right, here's what I remember. There's monks in the Middle Ages or something.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I know that Umberto Eco was visiting the University of Toronto,
Mm-hmm.
where I first met you as I was a grad student,
Mm-hmm.
and spent some time in the monstrous library that is there. Giant concrete brutalist turkey that is the main library.
Oh, God, I don't think that was his inspiration. I can't imagine.
I believe he said it was one of the inspirations for the library in the book.
Yep.
I think so. I think I'm remembering that story correctly.
Yeah, it's possible.
I'll put a note in the show notes if I'm wrong. But and so I assume that there's something to do with manuscripts because monks in Middle Ages and Echo, but that's about all I remember.
So it's a very cool, it's a weird and cool book. It's kind of remarkable. So Eco, like you said, he passed away in 2016, but he was a medievalist, a philosopher, very well known for his work in semiotics. His dissertation was on aesthetics and Aquinas, and I think one of his early books also was on this. So, a very kind of nuts and bolts kind of medievalist in a lot of ways, like philosophy, semiotics, and so on. But also he wrote novels. The Name of the Rose is, I think, really the outstanding one. And was also very engaged in kind of the public fora, writing for newspapers and things like this. So this is the kind of person he was and the ways in which he engaged with culture. So The Name of the Rose, I think, is really fascinating because like some of the other works we've read that are by medievalists, so I'm thinking, for example, of The Lord of the Rings, you could also say this of some of C.S. Lewis's writing, you can see all the medievally stuff kind of all that deep knowledge of the Middle Ages coming out in the work. But there's also this very literary and philosophical playfulness that's highly intertextual. So he's crossing paths with Dante and with Borges and with the Sherlock Holmes stories. You're in a world of books that are all referring to one another. And also the novel itself is about books. So it's got this really interesting kind of Hall of Mirrors quality to it, which I think is very neat. And the first time I read it, like I said, I was still in my teens. I think I was in college when it came out. So I was reading it at that time. And as a young person, I was already very interested in the Middle Ages, but I didn't know a whole lot. I knew a certain amount, but I didn't know a whole lot, right? And so reading that book was absolutely fascinating because I was learning about that world through the text I was studying in college. It's at the same time as I was reading the novel. So it was almost like there were lots of doors into closets full of information about philosophy or about history of the early 13th century or about heresy or about, you know what I mean? It was like...
It was like he had packed so much of what he had learned about the Middle Ages into the novel that
yes.
you could then unpack it and then learn about the Middle Ages through that.
It was super fun for that reason. Exactly. And also on the literary level too, because I love the Sherlock Holmes books and it was really fun to have, the narrator and sort of protagonist, I guess you would say, of the book is a young monk called Adso of Melk. And his mentor, the senior monk that teaches him and he travels with during the sort of central narrative of the book is William of Baskerville. And the description of him is, the physical description of him is, I'm just going to see if I can find it real quick because it will sound familiar to you. Let's see if I can find it. Here. Brother William's physical appearance was at that time such as to attract the attention of the most inattentive observer. His height surpassed that of a normal man, and he was so thin that he seemed still taller. His eyes were sharp and penetrating. His thin and slightly beaky nose gave his countenance the expression of a man on the lookout, save in certain moments of sluggishness of which I shall speak. His chin also denoted a firm will, though the long face covered with freckles, such as I often saw among those born between Hibernia and Northumbria, could occasionally express hesitation and puzzlement. In time I realized that what seemed a lack of confidence was only curiosity, but at the beginning I knew little of this virtue, which I thought rather a passion of the covetous spirit. Boy that I was first and most deeply struck by some clumps of yellowish hair that protruded from his ears, and by his thick blonde eyebrows. He had seen perhaps 50 springs, and was therefore already very old, but his tireless body moved with an agility I myself often lacked. His energy seemed inexhaustible when a burst of activity overwhelmed him, but from time to time, as if his vital spirit had something of the crayfish, he moved backward in moments of inertia, and I watched him lie for hours on my pallet in my cell, uttering barely a few monosyllables. On these occasions, a vacant, absent expression appeared in his eyes, and I would have suspected he was in the power of some vegetable substance capable of producing visions, if the obvious temperance of his life had not led me to reject this thought. So it's this long description that's on the one at the same time really vivid, evocative of a particular character. But there's all these neat little intertextual references to the first description of Sherlock Holmes in A Study in Scarlet. So if you know the books, you're like, hey, I've seen this before. And then there's many moments like that. And same thing with like short stories of Borges, with regard to like the Garden of Forking Paths and things like that. There's all these echoes in the book. So you're always at once in this one book and in all the other books. So it's like a labyrinth, very much like the labyrinth that these guys sort of solve the mystery in. So it's I don't know, I found it really like moving through a landscape that's got all these little buried treasures in it.
Yeah, it feels like it is a real like compendium of the things that fascinated Eco, that he managed to find a structure and a story that would allow him to put in all the little things he's been thinking about. It reminded me of Rings of Saturn, the way you just described it in that sense by Sebald that we talked about a while back, where it's like, it's a form. Sebald constructed a very different form, but a form that nevertheless was able to hold on to all these little things that he could connect in all these intriguing ways. And Eco maybe put in more of a plot, but it sounds like for you, one of the main pleasures was this little network of connections, or all these little tidbits scattered throughout the plot.
Yeah, that's such a good comparison because, like you said, the book is rather different in some ways. Like you've got a mystery plot going in this one, right? But the nature of the pleasure of the book, 100% very similar, at least for me.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and one of the things, we were describing the ways in which there's all kinds of neat information about the Middle Ages sort of tucked into The Name of the Rose, and how you kind of can unlock more and more of that as your own knowledge base grows, or at least that was my experience. So, for example, once I'd gotten into graduate school, I was reading a fair amount about illustrated apocalypse manuscripts from medieval Spain.
Nice.
And there's quite a bit about that. Or at least there's a number of important passages that refer to the Beatus manuscripts in The Name of the Rose. So the first time I read the book, I was like, I understood like 2% of what was going on in those passages. But then when I read it when I was in grad school, I was like, oh, I totally know exactly what's going on here. It was really pleasurable in this different kind of way. But one of the other things he does, and I think this is very enchanting, is he reproduces some of the, how can I put it, the literary flavor of medieval texts, and in particular, ekphrastic texts. So there's a whole lot of passages in this book that give you a sense of how ekphrasis seems, like what it's like to look at some piece of art, especially art that seems to have a kind of embedded narrative to it, and describe it in I was going to say excruciating detail, but that's
right. That's right. Excruciating detail is often how ekphrasis works.
No, I absolutely love it. So when I say excruciating, I mean excruciating in a really good way.
Yeah, exquisite.
Exquisite, I guess, is what I'm looking for. But there's this, so early in the book, this is like page 40, so it's early in the book, Adso of Melk and his mentor, William of Baskerville, have come to the monastery where they're going to be spending, the whole narrative, like where all the action takes place. And they've just gotten there. They found their place. They're going to be sleeping. And Adso goes wandering off into the church. And he looks at the door of the church. And it's a very elaborately decorated tympanum, like the sort of the carved area right above and around the door. And there's this incredibly multi-page detailed description of it, which I will not try to read. But I'm just going to read a couple lines. And you can see what I mean by the literary flavor. He says, when our eyes had finally grown accustomed to the gloom, the silent speech of the carved stone, accessible as it immediately was to the gaze and the imagination of anyone, for images are the literature of the layman, dazzled my eyes and plunged me into a vision that even today my tongue can hardly describe. And then he goes into the detail. He says, I saw a throne set in the sky and a figure seated on the throne. And then he goes on and gives all kinds of detail. And so right away, as we there's almost this threshold passage where your eyes get accustomed to the bloom, and now you can see and hear the silent speech of the carved stone, which dazzles your eyes, right, plunges you into a vision, and your tongue can hardly describe it. So already there's this confusion of senses. And as you move through it, that sense of the confusion of senses just becomes more and more and more intense until finally, when it gets very listy, so you could just imagine how excited I am, as I read this passage. But as he gets toward the end of it, he's seeing the valley of the Last Judgment. He says, I was terrified and could hardly restrain my tears. And I seemed to hear, Or did I really hear that voice and I saw those visions that had accompanied my youth as a novice, my first reading of the sacred books? And then there's this, like, again, really incredible synesthetic kind of passage at the end. And he trembles, he's just overcome by this experience of the sound and the vision. And I found that so neat. And there's a couple of other passages that are doing something similar, but that's just a good example of it, because you do see both, like, artwork of the Middle Ages that has that level of intricate detail that he's describing there, that Adso is describing, right? But also you find texts that do this ekphrasis. So, for example, I don't know if we've talked before about Baudry of Bourgoy's letter where he describes the chamber of the Countess Adela, where it's this very elaborate description, like for like hundreds and hundreds of lines, of how this room was painted to represent the cosmos. This idea that you can fold the entire universe into this artistic thing that is one and you experience all at once, but also you move through in time. So Eco does that in this book, which I find really cool because I don't know any modern literature that does that. I've only ever seen that in medieval texts. So I find that very cool.
Oh, interesting.
I know, is that wild?
I, of course, was thinking about the ekphrastic passages in the Iliad, which I'm sure you're also a big fan of, the description of the elaborate shield that Hephaestus forged and so forth.
Oh, yes.
And in the introduction that Emily Wilson wrote, which is just really good, I have to say, and looking at all the different things you might look out for in the text. But she does talk about how these passages have that marvelous opening up feeling that they often, allow the poem to include more of the world, and this sense that you're capturing of like the painting that is trying to capture the cosmos, which is then again being captured in a text, and how long that text has to go to try to exhaust is maybe the word, but encapsulate the painting is really remarkable. Although, as you say, exhausting.
Yeah, but like in a really good way. Afterward, you're like, "Whoa, that was really good."
I'm sure if I sat down and thought a bit, I could think of modern works that do a bit of that. But you're right, that isn't done as commonly.
Yeah. It's unusual, at least. And that's what I mean by this medieval flavor. And there's a couple of other, there's a number of other passages in The Name of the Rose, too, where you get that sense of, like, such a seamless representation of something you find in medieval text. So, for example, there's a lovely, beautiful passage that describes the scriptorium, so where the monks copy manuscripts and study manuscripts. It's a beautiful description of this wondrous, light-filled space where people work. And what's really neat is it's described in terms of number. So he'll describe like the number of windows that were lighting it on each side. And there's this kind of emphasis, not just on number as a kind of description of architectural detail, but in terms of numerology, so that we get a sense of like how number and proportion give meaning to the world, like the created world, but also the world of art, like the world that human beings make for themselves. Like he'll say in another passage, since there were 40 windows, a number truly perfect, derived from the decoupling of the quadrigon, as if the 10 commandments had been multiplied by the 4 cardinal virtues, 40 monks could work at the same time. Though at that moment there were perhaps 30. So there's this neat move, right, where you're getting this sense of number and order, or, putting everything in relationship. And yet, even though 40 is the number, actually there's about 30 guys there that day, right? So there's this sense of like the real world never quite living up to this perfect ideal that's out there, kind of hovering over us all the time. And again, very much something you find in medieval texts. And he's just reproducing that so beautifully.
Yeah, we talked a bit in our episode on Isidore's etymologies about that sort of etymological approach to the language of the world, but that also went into numbers. And didn't Isidore write a book about numbers? I'm pretty sure I read a book that Isidore wrote about numbers. Yeah, okay.
No, for sure. And also that like emphasis on etymology, like that Isidorean thing that you were describing is all over this book.
Yeah. Oh, good.
So all that good stuff is in there.
So if there's etymology in the book, is it happening in like Latin terms, or is it in Italian terms, or is it in English terms? Like, did the translator have to reckon with that?
Well, there's kind of a couple different things going on there. One is you see phrases in Latin now and then. And so the first time I read the book, I was like, they washed over me like, oh, there's some Latin,
Because you didn't know Latin yet. Yeah.
Well, no, right. I know where, and as time went by, so I'd read it differently, right? So there's phrases that come through in Latin. And so etymology shows up in the Latin phrases that are sometimes resonating in a way that, is really interesting with the English translation and would have also resonated with the Italian original novel. But also, we have one character in particular, Salvatore, but also a couple of other characters to some extent who are speaking in a Romance language vernacular. And Salvatore in particular is said to be describing a language that is no one of those languages. So there's like French bits and Catalan bits and Italian bits, and it's like all very mixed. And so I think you would find that particularly interesting, the ways in which language is representing individual characters' ways of being in the world, because it reflects his travels and his movement between communities over time. So that's not quite etymology, but this idea of language moving.
Oh yeah, and like that fascination with that moment when Romance languages were forming, when there was potential for people who are well traveled to sort of bridge the gap between different Romance languages. Languages that are derived from Latin more easily, that you might expect people to be able to potentially communicate across those divides, and to just get really excited by that. I can see Eco doing that. Absolutely. I love that sort of thing.
Yeah. And also you get like interesting little plays on language and little puns that happen in connection with German language too, because Adso is, Adso of milk, right? So German is his his mother tongue.
Right.
And he brings that out at different moments. I'm just seeing if I can find it really quickly. Oh, I can't find it. But there's one passage where he talks about having a little misunderstanding with somebody that had to do with, you could tell it's the sort of German way he would have been pronouncing a Latin word. So, a misunderstanding that ends in laughter is coming out of this whole fact that people are communicating in Latin with these different accents and with loan words that do or do not function well in that exchange across cultures. There's all kinds of like neat little things there that are again reminding us of the nature of the world of the early 14th century.
Now, do you think somebody who, didn't grow up to become a professor of medieval studies would still enjoy this book?
Well, it's funny, like the book made a real splash, I remember, in the 80s. I think people liked the mystery plot of it. I don't know how they manage the parts that get like, deep into, heretical movements of the 1320s, I'm not sure how that went really. But the mystery is absolutely fascinating. And I've been talking so much about the texture of the book and the flavor of it, so to speak, that I haven't talked about the mystery. The mystery is actually incredibly intricate. It hinges on figuring out how it is that the library, which is locked away and inaccessible to everybody but the librarian and his assistant, is both the setting for some of the murders and also what's motivating the murders. And, so there's this beautiful mystery plot, that drives things forward. And that's how you get the movie, and so on coming out of it, which is also satisfying in its own way, with Sean Connery as William of Baskerville and a very, very young Christian Slater as Adso of Milk.
Okay.
It's a fun ride. I promise. I promise.
All right. Fair enough. I want to throw the question back at you that you gave to me. This is a reread. You haven't read this in a good long while. How has it changed for you? Can you feel changes in yourself in the act of rereading it?
Well, it's funny, there's two things that I noticed. One is, so in the years since the last time I read this book, I have seen The Grand Budapest Hotel. And I don't know if this is a movie that you've watched.
I have seen this one. I quite liked it.
Yeah, it's great. It's like, I could talk about it all day. I absolutely love that movie. Maybe we'll come back to it sometime. I'll figure out some circuitous way for us to get to it. But the opening of the preface to The Name of the Rose is written in the first person voice. So it's Umberto Eco talking about a book that he was given by somebody in 1968, which is a 19th century edition of a 14th century manuscript, which is Adso of Milk's
Right.
And he describes taking all kinds of notes from it, and then he loses it, and he thinks maybe he just imagined the whole thing. But then at some point in 1970 in Buenos Aires, he comes across another book. It's a Castilian version of a little work by Milo Temeshvar on the use of mirrors in the game of chess, which is an Italian translation of the original Georgian book from 1934. And in it, there are lots of quotations from Adso's manuscript. Mind blown, right?
Right.
And so this whole plot where the story that we're going to hear is embedded within a frame narrative. It's so much like the ways in which the opening frame of the Grand Budapest Hotel structures itself. I remember like reading this and being like, oh, I am 100% sure that whoever's doing that screenplay knows this opening, because it just situates itself so beautifully in a such a graceful way, because both times they're evoking a world that's gone.
Right.
Anyway, so that was kind of fun. So that little detail was fun. The other thing I think I found myself reflecting on was just, this pleasurable world, like this intense attractiveness of a library, because they're constantly trying to get into the library. Once they get into the library, they're trying to figure out how to make their way through the library. And once they do that, they're trying to figure out how to get into this enclosed room in the library. This idea that, what is a library space? What does it represent to you? I've been thinking about this a lot lately because, we've been talking a lot about reading, and I've been thinking about how bookshelves change over time. And I remember as a very young person, my bookshelves always being very, very orderly. Like I knew, I could tell you where every book was on the shelves, because what was outside on the shelves was corresponding to what was inside my head. Like it was 1-to-1 kind of thing, right? That's obviously a very early in life thing, but it's always sort of present to me as like, oh, that's the bliss you want to inhabit. That's the place you want to be. And so, so thinking about library shelves has been something that's been really on my mind. So the book I was super fascinated with, and, thinking about exactly how books were placed in that library space and what was going on there with the descriptions of that placement. And I also, since we've been moving to this new book reading format, find that I've got like a little sub bookshelf area. I've got these one in my bedroom and one in the living room, where they're like little areas where I've got the books I'm kind of excited about. So they're not in the order of a larger library collection, but they're like this little mini bookshelf areas. So I'm very excited about them. They're almost like the little rooms in the labyrinth.
That's wonderful. I have a little bit of shelf space dedicated to books that we've already talked about on the Spouter-Inn.
Oh, cool.
Which is not an exhaustive shelf. And also other books have made their way into it the way books will when you're trying to find any place to put this book. But nevertheless, there it is.
Yeah, I think our new format will change our bookshelves in all kinds of interesting ways.
Well, okay, those are the two main books that we came to talk about, and those were some fun conversations. Is there anything else you want to mention before we go? Do you have anything exciting coming up, or any books that you're chomping at the bit to get started on?
Well, I do have a couple. There's one actually that I just finished reading, which was really enjoyable and was actually kind of a really fun counterpart to be reading while I was reading The Name of the Rose. It's called Stolen Fragments, Black Markets, Bad Faith, and the Illicit Trade in Ancient Artifacts by Roberta Mazza.
Yes, you mentioned that.
Yeah. So it's basically about, I don't know how arcane and interesting this is, but the whole Hobby Lobby Museum of the Bible thing, and the Dead Sea Scroll fragments, and the little bit of a Sappho poem fragment, and how that kind of marketplace around papyrus fragments has been working. I've been following this for years, with a couple of different blogs that talk about it and news articles. And now a book's come out that just has all the tea, and it's tasty. It's so tasty.
No.
It is wild.
I've heard a little bit about it, and this sort of thing is always going to just be filled with awfulness. And the bits I know are terrible. But yeah, what is there any particularly juicy bit you want to share?
I don't know if there's a particularly good juicy bit to choose, but what was interesting about it was the ways in which fragments become like monetized, they become part of the marketplace, and that fact creates all kinds of complicated ethical constraints for researchers. So, in some cases you're talking about forgeries, but in other cases you're talking about manuscript fragments that are retrieved by destroying what they call cartonnage, which is where papyrus has been used to make a kind of paper mache that might be used for portrait masks for the dead in mummy burials and so on. So you're having this destruction take place, and also often very poorly provenanced papyri, that are out there. And researchers have a dilemma, right? It might be, oh, I really want to do an edition of these fragments. I want to write an article that puts them into their proper historical context. But you're encouraging this bad cycle of unethical behavior and sometimes illegal behavior. Right? It's in many different fields this dilemma exists, but for papyrologists, it plays out in a particular kind of way. And so this dilemma of where does the good lie? Because sometimes you could say, well, if I don't write about it, it'll just disappear into the marketplace. It'll disappear into a collection and nobody will know about it. So how do you navigate that? So the book, as I said, it's really enjoyable for the tea it serves up, but it's also very serious. She ends up talking about like this real substantial dilemma that people have. She says at the end, I want to channel all that anger toward those of my academic colleagues who are still explaining that they publish unprovenanced and illegal papyri and other manuscripts, quote, because scholarship comes first, end quote. You should have added a possessive adjective to the line, as you certainly meant, quote, because my scholarship comes first, end quote. You are publishing undocumented when not patently illegal antiquities, not for the sake of scholarship, but to get your name out there, in the newspaper headlines and on the lips of your esteemed colleagues so that you can add a miserable line to what matters most to you, your curriculum vitae. Whoa,
Ooh.
whoa! It's so. I mean, that part is very direct. The whole book's not like that, but at the end, she's like putting her cards on the table. She's like, we got to really think seriously about this.
Yeah. Wow.
So that was enjoyable, and it resonated beautifully with Adso. Many years later, coming to the site where the magnificent library had been, the whole monastery had burned down in this catastrophic event right at the end of the narrative. And he goes around gathering these little scraps that he can find. And he describes doing this wonderful thing. He could sometimes figure out from the scrap what text it was. And so then when he would acquire a new copy of that text. And so he'd assembled, he says, a little kind of mini library of the original library, the Labyrinth Library at the monastery. Not complete, but whatever fragments he found, as a way of trying to retrieve the message that was left in those scattered fragments. So that's why it was weird reading Maza's stolen fragments while also reading The Name of the Rose.
Oh, interesting. That also sounds like the act of reading a book like The Name of the Rose and coming across something that you recognize, or maybe somebody just tells you, oh, that's a paraphrase of the first description of Sherlock Holmes in Studying Scarlet.
Yeah.
And then you have to go and grab that and add that to your mental library of other books that you're reading.
Exactly.
Very interesting.
Super fun.
That book sounds really engaging.
So are there books you're looking forward to reading?
Well, although I didn't really get any books as a holiday present, I did pick something up for myself when I realized that it existed and immediately bought it. You know how that's like. This is an anthology of poetry that came out in 2024, and it is called Output, an anthology of computer-generated text, 1953 to 2023, edited by Lillian Yvonne Bertram and Nick Montfort. It's a big, nice, thick anthology of excerpts from a bunch of different writers who have written poems over the years and poetry over the years with the aid of computers, often writing a program that'll somehow process or generate text. And it's very interesting to be doing that kind of anthology now, as large language models radically redefine what that kind of means to people.
Yeah.
The idea that, I'm a poet and I use computers to help generate my texts just hits differently in this age of ChatGPT and other LLMs, other large language models. So good for them for trying to make an attempt to reclaim the very, let's say, humanist ways. I mean that in a very broad sense, but the ways that aren't sort of like, oh, I'm just going to, dear ChatGPT, please write me a poem. Oh, here it is. Yay. But, the much more engaged artistic work that has gone into that in the past, in 50, 60, 70 years of history that this book covers. I only just got it. I'm super curious about looking through it. But I do have to say one thing about it that I confirmed as I was flipping through it is that I'm not in it. Which is fine, but that is and has been a part of my poetry practice for a while. And, there are poets who I, know who are in it. It's totally okay, but it is giving me a moment to think about what I have and haven't done as a writer to be part of a public conversation that would allow my work to end up in an anthology like this. This is actually the second time this has happened to me. A few years ago, an anthology of conceptual writing came out that mentioned me in passing. One of the poets in their sort of introduction to their work was kind enough and thoughtful enough to think of something that I had written and mention it as work that they were thinking about as to contextualize their own work, and that's great. And I'm not saying I deserve to be or am owed a position at this, but
it invites you to think about what's going on in that conversation. Not that you necessarily want to participate more, but where and how is the conversation taking place, right? And where do you want to sit relative to that?
Yeah, exactly. And what does this mean as as a reader and as a writer? How do I participate in the officialization, in the canonicalization of the kinds of text that I've also made? I mean, many of the pieces flipping through look like things that I have also made. And again, I'm not trying to claim any, it's not just me. Other people came up with these things independently or whatever. We're all drawing from the same well, and their work is lovely, and I don't need to be there. But it just is making me reflect on my position in this space.
Well, you're making me think about canon formation in connection, just because this is something I know about with regard to Renaissance and metaphysical poetry, the ways in which that worked and how the canons were formed and reformed. It was almost like every couple of decades, somebody would produce a new collection, and that would shift the ways in which the canon was being formed, not just making it bigger, the canon of those lyrics, but also some would drop out and some would come in. And I wonder if that's that's the period I know about, but I wonder if that's something that goes on in other periods as well, and even in this kind of genre of writing.
Well, I imagine so, but also you worked on the Norton Anthology of Literature for a while there, and you were involved in some of these questions about who are young students and people who are encountering this literature. What are they going to be encountering? What are going to be their guideposts as they think about medieval literature? And you, I'm sure, got to kick some people out and pull some people into the conversation.
Yeah. Well, that's always what's going on, right? And so canon formation is this is a whole topic we might come back to in another framework and discuss at greater length, but it's always both prescriptive and descriptive, right? It's always both reflecting appetites that are out there and also giving a form and drawing lines around a particular canon of whether it's lyrics or whatever kind of literature it might be, and putting it back out there in the world. So there's this weird kind of, chicken and the egg quality to canon formation that I find really interesting.
Yeah. And it's just interesting finding myself connected in a different way than I might have been otherwise.
No, you're interpolated right in the middle of it there.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm super looking forward to actually looking through and reading the anthology. I mean, anthologies are tricky things to read, so to speak, but definitely spending more time with it and exploring it and looking at all the stuff I don't know about that's in here. And it looks like a great resource. It looks like a lovely book. I'm super excited by it. So yay.
Yeah, one of the things I might do, or at least I'm looking forward to rereading over the next few weeks, and so maybe it'll come up when we get together to talk about books again, is Lee Maricle's Memory Serves Oratories. That's a book we've thought about together and also returned to as a point of reference. And I'm working on something where I really need to go back yet again to that text, and I get something else out of it every time I read it. So I'm really looking forward to thinking about and talking about what that's like and what things are visible now that weren't visible last time.
Wonderful. Well, I don't know if that's going to be the book that we talk about next time. I don't know what I'm going to talk about next time just yet. But listeners, I hope that you have enjoyed this episode and this new format as we try to figure out our sense of how this flow goes and what we're doing here. In the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We'd always love to hear from you. And this show is made possible by people like you supporting us on Patreon. And patrons get to hang out with us in a friendly Discord. So find out more at patreon.com/megaphonic. Show notes with everything that we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/77. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
see you again at Spouter-Inn.